she was gonna keep. Oh yeah, alright, take it easy baby, make it last all night. She was an American girl.
This is Deborahcratic, a podcast where we sit down with everyday Americans and hear their extraordinary stories. I'm your host, Deborah Drucker. Come along with me as we discuss those things that we were always told not to talk about: politics, religion, and more. I promise you'll be inspired and have your mind opened by the end of this episode.
Well, it was kinda cold that night. She stood alone on the balcony.
It has been an unreal presidential election cycle, to say the least. From President Biden's withdrawal to Trump being shot at. As we watch the rise of the Harris-Walz campaign, we are truly in uncharted territory. We need to understand what is at stake and how we can support those that are helping shape the future of our great country. Please listen to Deborahcratic to hear from local and national leaders that are working to make our world a better place. With love, Deborahcratic.
She was an American girl.
Today on Deborahcratic, we will be speaking with Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips. Dean believes in relieving the economic hardship felt by working families, and as a Democrat has a reputation for reaching across the aisle and working together with the Republicans. He is focused on repairing our broken political system and has always been a servant to his community. Dean was a presidential candidate in the 2024 Democratic primary, and today we have the good fortune of hearing his story. Let's find out how this American patriot became the well-established and passionate problem solver that he is today. Welcome, Dean. How are you?
I'm fantastic, Deborah. Good to be with you.
Thank you for coming. I know you are in Minnesota right now, but where are you originally from?
I'm from Minnesota. I haven't made it too far in my 55 years, Deborah. I was born in St. Paul in 1969, January 20th. My mom was 24 years old. My father was in Vietnam, a soldier serving in the U.S. Army, had earned an ROTC scholarship because he couldn't afford college and wanted to be an attorney. So that was his ticket. And unfortunately was killed in action when I was just 6 months old in July of 69. Just 3 days, by the way, after the moon landing, which gives me some joy to know that he and so many other soldiers on the ground in Vietnam got to see America, at its very best at a time where clearly, in hindsight, and even at that time, we were surely at our very worst. So that's how my life began, with a little tragedy.
What a loss. You didn't even get to meet him.
Didn't get to meet him, but I wear his dog tag around my neck every single day. I think of him every single day. I've heard stories, I have photos, and the greatest treasure you can imagine, Deborah, is my mom gave me the box of all their reel-to-reel tapes that they exchanged when he was an officer in Vietnam. I've digitized them, I keep them on my phone, and to hear him, his feelings, his thoughts, his salutation of his new son, me, is really an extraordinary blessing, one that very few Gold Star children have.
Well, then who did you grow up with in Minnesota?
I'll tell you, Deborah, that's my story. I got lucky. I got really, really freaking lucky. My mom met and remarried a wonderful man, Dean Phillips, in 1972. He adopted me and brought me into just a magnificent family. My grandmother became Dear Abby, my aunt Ann Landers, so filled with advice, probably more than anybody could possibly want. But most of all, blessings of love and opportunity and education and experiential travel, everything that so many kids in this world never have a chance to experience. So I got lucky, and I think nothing drives me more than that spirit of gratitude and just wishing and working towards trying to bestow even the tiniest of my many blessings on so many kids who just do not have a semblance of the good fortune that I had.
And did you grow up with siblings?
Yeah, my mom and adopted dad had another son, my brother Tyler, who is my best friend. He's a risk manager. I'm a risk taker. So we meet in the middle, like any good relationship. And we're going to talk about bipartisanship. And then my parents did divorce. My dad remarried and had two more children. So we have I have two brothers, a sister, and a wonderful family filled with a lot of blessings.
And were you the eldest then?
As far as I know, I'm the oldest. Yes, 55.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was that home life like?
It was amazing. One thing you realize when you get older is your life is the life you think everybody leads. And until you have that epiphany, when you realize that things are up to you, or gratitude, as was the case for me. But grew up in Minnesota, got to experience the joys of living in the Midwest and riding my bike anywhere, and playing in the woods and going to summer camp in Maine, travel. Got to see a lot of the world. My parents were intentional about exposing my brother and me to the world and culture. Clearly, having a grandma who was a celebrity was a whole different world in Los Angeles, but very grounding as well, especially because she was the one that taught me to engage and to care about politics, and to not take no for an answer, and to stick up for the underdog, and a lot of the great life lessons. And my mom is a wonderful mom. She's an entrepreneur, had a wonderful store in downtown Minneapolis that outfitted Prince for his first couple record albums. I had a really fascinating upbringing filled with interesting characters, gay, straight, and other, black, white, and brown. And that was my world. And I'm awfully lucky to have come from that background.
Wow, so lucky to come from such a, disruptive beginning,
Yeah,
and then to find this beautiful family. I'm very
exactly.
happy for you. Obviously, you turned out to be a very well-rounded person, and a person from privilege who has such compassion for the underdog is a really wonderful thing to see. So again, thank you for being here. When you were growing up in that home, were politics discussed, or did politics play a role?
Absolutely. In fact, I remember, my family always portrayed themselves as Democrats. I think a lot of it, a Jewish immigrant family, came here in the 1890s, both my maternal and paternal sides of the families, both biological and adopted. So you can imagine the affection at that time for the Democratic Party, and President Roosevelt and others who helped at least provide opportunities for the Jewish community in diaspora and World War II. But I'll tell you, the first real political memory I had was in 1980. So I was 11 years old. I go to my school assembly one morning, and John Anderson comes to speak. A former Republican congressman from Illinois, had challenged Ronald Reagan in the GOP primary, dropped out of the GOP primary, and declared himself an independent candidate for president. So he comes to speak to my school, and I never forgot his words, talked about the need for independence in politics, how money in politics was destructive. Didn't quite understand at the time. I sure do now. And I was wowed. I'd never seen a presidential candidate before. So all of, the whole class was just thrilled. And that night we went to dinner in Minneapolis, four generations of my family, my brother and me, my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. I was seated next to my grandmother, Abby, and she asked about my day, and I told her it was amazing. The guy who was going to be president came to speak to us. And I remember she stopped me and said, "Honey, if he's speaking to a bunch of seventh graders this close to the election, I don't think he's going to be the guy." So that was my first lesson in politics. And then she said, "Before you continue, are you a Democrat or a Republican?" And I said, "Grandma, I don't even know what those are. I'm 11 years old." And she said, "You're a Democrat." And I literally, Deborah, went home that night. My parents had the World Book Encyclopedia up on some shelves. I opened it up. I looked at Democratic and Republican, what the definitions were. Didn't quite understand it at the time, but I was anointed a Democrat by my grandma Abby when I was 11 years old. And politics were, I wouldn't say they're every night at the kitchen table, but a family very committed to public service, civic service, philanthropy, and paying it forward, and looking after the underdog. That was the ethos of our family, and clearly had been the ethos of the Democratic Party, although I think in some ways that is changing.
Yeah, it's a different time. Was your grandmother, Abby, was she the main person that focused on politics with you?
Yeah, more than my parents certainly instilled in me appreciation for community service and philanthropy and care and compassion. But yeah, my Grandma Abby was absolutely my political inspiration. In fact, when I was in college, she inspired me to apply for an internship, which I did in the U.S. Senate, and I became an intern for Senator Patrick Leahy. And she was absolutely the one who inspired it, encouraged it. In fact, you could almost say demanded it. And as someone who started as a housewife in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in the late 40s and by the mid 50s was probably the most well-known woman in the world, had audiences with John F. Kennedy and Reagan and Clinton and Johnson, and Humphrey was her dear friend. And yeah, someone who really cared deeply and inspired me, no question. And she, as you might remember, was really at the forefront of human rights, at a time when speaking of abortion and gay rights and women's reproductive rights, all these things were really kind of taboo. And she brought a lot of those to the forefront at a time where most people were afraid to come out of the shadows, out of the closet, and have those conversations. And I think she saw the need to realize some of those values for which she stood.
Well, did you realize how famous she was at the time?
No. I'll tell you what. So here's
I mean, dear Abby, everybody asked her something.
That's true. I'll tell you the first time I realized that something was a little different is she came to Minneapolis to visit us, and we had usually seen her out in California. She came to Minneapolis and wanted to spend an afternoon with my brother and me, so she took us out and picked us up in a stretched limousine, and we went to the McDonald's drive-through. And I will never forget that juxtaposition of her, her in that car with us going through the McDonald's drive-through. That was probably the only time I saw on display, kind of that celebrity that people would expect, because that usually wasn't her thing. But that's when I look at. I don't know many 11-year-olds that read the newspaper, kind of thing. So if you didn't read the newspaper, you didn't know who she was. But
Right.
that was. Yeah.
But for some reason, I feel like I knew who she was as a young person,
I encounter so many people, Deborah, who grew up in rural America, and they may have been in the closet, or they may have had, domestic strife, or heartbreak, or loss, or tragedy. And people come up to me and give me a hug and just say, "Your grandma, saved my life," or "She was the only person, who showed compassion." Because my grandma would get 10,000 letters a week. She couldn't personally answer every one of them, but she had a staff that would ensure that if you enclosed a self-addressed stamped envelope, you would get a response to your question. And I think she was, this was before the internet and Google and counselors and therapists. And I think she really was, in some ways, a therapist to the entire country, especially people who couldn't access it otherwise.
So I'm going to assume she was a real role model for you.
Yeah.
So growing up, was she one of the main role models?
I tell you, both my grandmothers, my mother, my maternal and paternal grandmothers, and my biological grandmother, who sadly lived in subsidized housing in St. Paul. This is my birth father, Artie Peffer's mom. Her husband, my grandpa Victor, died when my dad Artie was just a little boy. She worked at a department store in St. Paul, Minnesota, to try to make ends meet. When I was growing up, I would visit her on occasion. And it was heartbreaking. She lived in subsidized housing. She would see me. She'd break down into tears because I reminded her so much of her son, my dad. She made matzo ball soup for me, and she taught me how to play piano. So she taught me to love music. My mother brought me to France and to Europe and taught me to love art and music and culture and interesting people and stories. My father taught me business. My grandmother Abby, taught me politics. I was brought up in an amazing household, or community, if you will, of complementary backgrounds and perspectives. And I really digested it, So no one particular grandma or grandpa influenced me more than others. I was the beneficiary of a village, of a real family village.
Very fortunate. And then was Ann Landers, is that Abby's daughter?
Twin sister.
Oh, her sister.
Twin sisters.
Oh, so she was your great aunt.
They were twins, their father owned a vaudeville theater in Sioux City, Iowa. They slept in the same bed as kids until the night they got married. They had never been apart. They lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin together. And it was my aunt, Ann Landers, who started her column first in Chicago And my grandma Abby helped her write it, and was a little bit jealous, I think, of her sister being in the big city, Chicago, while my grandma was still in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Eventually, my grandma thought, well, hey, you're doing pretty well with this thing. I can do the same thing. And then she moved to San Francisco with my grandfather, went to the San Francisco Chronicle, explained to them that she'd been helping her sister in Chicago with her column and to give her a shot. They didn't want to, but they did, and the rest is history. And they had a little bit of a falling out for, some decades because of the competition.
Did they have any background in psychology, or like what was the impetus for them to become these advice providers?
So I think what they had was they grew up with their father owning a theater. They played violin. They would get up on stage all the time. So they loved performing, which they did until the day they died. They would get up in front of rooms of people. We would all cringe, but they would sing duets in front of the piano, that kind of thing. So they loved to perform. When they were in college together, Morningside College in Iowa, they wrote the campus kind of gossip column called the Campus Rat, which I have copies of. Miraculously, I found the entire volumes of all their articles. And they kind of, they merged advice with gossip and kind of the goings-on campus. And I think that was the impetus for eventually becoming advice columnists. When Ann Landers, the original Ann Landers, died, that was my aunt who eventually took over that column. So they weren't trained in psychology or therapy, but what they did, and this is the big difference, each of them had a Rolodex filled with the most extraordinary experts in any field you can imagine. So they never answered the question directly. They would pose the questions brought to them to the specialists of the day, the director of psychology at the Mayo Clinic, or the president of Notre Dame University, or a Supreme Court justice, whatever it was. In a way, they were almost like the Google,
right,
of mid-century America.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I want to get back to you and how you arrived at your political perspective, and really what the impetus was for you to become a politician. So I want to back up a little bit, because I know first, before you became a politician, you were obviously exposed to business and philanthropy and much advice by your adopted family. And then you worked your way up through that family business. I think you came in as fifth generation, and
correct.
The business was Phillips Distilling. And I saw that, wow, you're also an entrepreneur, because you took that company and you grew the Belvedere vodka brand into the world's most successful spirits brand. And then you sold it to LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, for those of you out there who don't know. And I just want to know, when did you get into the family business? At what age? Was that after you went to university or during summers? Tell me about your business career, and then we'll talk about your political career.
It started, actually, my great-grandfather, I have two great-grandfathers on both sides of my family, both in business, both greatly successful, both of whom told me their life stories. My grandpa Yale Johnson, my mother's grandfather, started one of the first cash and carry grocery stores in St. Paul, Minnesota, an entrepreneur himself. My grandpa Jay Phillips, and in 8th grade, I think at 12 years old, started his first business. Couldn't get a lease, couldn't get a loan from the bank, so he asked his father to help him. But at age 12, started a little distribution company. So my great-grandfathers would certainly inspired me. My first activity at the family business was going to the office with my dad on weekends. He would go in for a while, and my brother and I would run around the business. The offices, downstairs was the production plant, where we bottled all the spirits. My first job at the company was when I was probably 14, 15. I was a summer intern. I built displays and cleaned bottles and put price tags on products all around stores. Worked in the warehouse, worked in the production plant, all the things. My father appropriately had higher expectations of me than anybody else in the business, and knew that I'd have to earn a position, if that's what I aspire to, and put me in a position to succeed by demonstrating to everybody else in the business that I would start at the ground floor and I'd work my way up. And that's exactly what I did. And the business was interesting because I was one of the first to establish a profit sharing program in the 1940s. A big part of the company culture was sharing success, making millionaires out of secretaries at that time. and then enriching the communities, sharing success with the communities that made it possible. That was really baked in to the family ethos. So my grandpa, my father used to always say, business is a means to an end, and the end is not aggregating as much money as possible, rather sharing as much as possible. So that was the motive in business, sell more, do better, earn more, so that we could help more. And that's probably the bridge that ultimately brought me to politics, because the policies in place in this country, frankly, I think do a disservice to too many Americans and do it ineffectively and inefficiently. And that's where business principles can merge with policy. So that's ultimately, I think, what brought me to this work.
So after you grow into this business, you take it step by step. I'm imagining you're doing summers there. You're doing, you're working there prior to graduating high school and getting a college degree, because you're really learning the steps of the business. So then you go off to university after you graduate high school. I see you went to Brown University, and then you got your MBA from University of Minnesota. And at that point, when you graduate with your MBA, do you go back to work in the family business?
Yeah, my father made it clear that if I wanted to rise through the ranks, that, like I said, I had to work twice as hard and earn half as much and demonstrate that I had the respect of my colleagues. And business school was integral to that. So I actually pursued my degree while I was still employed. It was a tough, long haul, weekends and nights, but got it done. And again, it's about, I think there's analogies to anything in life, demonstrating to those with whom you work that you're willing to do anything that you're asking them to do. And so I busted my tail, and it was worthwhile.
And then you're still on this entrepreneurial path, because I see that you built an ice cream brand, which was called Talenti Gelato, and
That's
this
right.
became America's best-selling ice cream brand. And then you sold that in 2015.
It's actually a great story. The founding partner, we had ultimately three partners. My father, my adopted dad, Eddie, passed away not long after making the first investment in Talenti. So I joined my two colleagues, Steve Gill and Josh Hochschuler. Josh had started this business, started a gelato shop in Dallas about 20 years ago. The shop did not do well, was going to close, and then he gets an order for packaged gelato from a local grocery store. So he's thrilled, but he realizes he cannot afford to have like a nice container made, like a Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs. They'd ask for a million units to order. So he went to a surplus store and finds on closeout like 1,000 jars, plastic jars with screw-on lids. And that was all he could afford. So he bought those jars, put Talenti in it because he could sticker them himself. And it was the lack of capital, the lack of resources that forced him to buy something very different that became the iconic part of the brand, Talenti Gelato, which to this very day, even after we sold it to Unilever, is in that same jar that he found at the closeout surplus store.
That's great.
Yeah, built it into a great success and sold it to Unilever, the owners of Ben & Jerry's, and essentially did the same thing we did in vodka. You had Absolute and Stoli fighting it out, price wars, and two big brands. We bring in Belvedere, a little bit higher level, luxury, does very well because it's aspirational. Ice cream, you had Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs fighting each other on price. And same thing, Talenti comes in a little bit premium, a little higher price point. And I won't lie that I think that politics, the political industrial industry, needs the same thing. You have Democrats and Republicans doing the same thing that Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs did, that Absolute and Stoli did, which is fighting so hard to beat each other that they really start losing sight of the customer. And I think there's an analogy between my business background and, frankly, I think what politics ultimately needs, which is a little bit more competition to succeed for all of us.
Well, then you go from the business of you're in the spirits business, and then you're in the ice cream business, and you said that your father had passed away. Who's running Phillips Distilling then?
Well, we sold the Belvedere brand. I had been running the business for the Phillips brands, which are a regional brand. Sold that as well. Ultimately sold Talenti Gelato. That was 2015. Which then brings me to the next entrepreneurial pursuit, which was opening coffee shops in Minneapolis. I love the idea of hospitality. As I see more erosion of people congregating together, I wanted to find a business that could satisfy what I thought was a communal need, which is gathering, with a awakeness need, which is caffeine. So started opened a few coffee shops right before the 2016 election. And that, Deborah, is what changed my life and all of ours.
Yeah, we're going to get to 2016. I read that 2016, when you heard that, Trump was going to run for president, that you promised your daughters that you would do something to resist that. And there's your segue into full-blown politics. Tell us what it was that fortified this passion to run for office.
So it was actually the election night itself that affected me. I really, like most Americans, I really didn't think he could win. I was appalled at what he stood for. I was shocked at how he introduced himself. And I just did not think it possible that the United States of America could ever elect somebody so deficient, so lacking in character and competency as Donald Trump. And I'll confess, on election night, I was just bewildered and dumbfounded. But I remember that night, Deborah, telling my family with whom I was watching the returns come in, that, we got to give him a chance, that hopefully he'll change his tune, that the White House will, has a tendency to mitigate the worst proclivities of people like him. And of course, I was wrong. But what happened is the next morning, I woke up to the sound of my youngest daughter, Pia, who was 16 at that time. She was crying in her bedroom. So I walked in, sat at the foot of her bed, and asked her what was wrong. And she was mortified. And she had just overcome Hodgkin's lymphoma as a young teen, which was traumatic, of course. She's doing great now.
Thank God.
And she's a gay woman. And I did not know that, Deborah, when she was 16. But I saw a fear in her eyes, I got to tell you, as a parent, that really left an indelible mark on me quickly. We FaceTimed her older sister, my daughter Daniela, who was a freshman at college, at the breakfast table. And I promised both of them that morning I would do something. And that's exactly what I did. But I looked at my district and I thought, oh no, the guy that night, Republican who had won by 14 points, four-term incumbent. My district had not elected a Democrat since the 1958 election.
I saw that.
But I got to tell you, it was, I've reached that moment in my life where the intersection between time and need rose, and I had to try, because that's what the resistance needed. It needed people to take down Republicans in districts that were currently red. And that was the only way we were going to resist Donald Trump, by flipping the House in 2018. And I gave it everything I had.
That was in Minnesota's 3rd district.
Right.
And you won by nearly 12 points as the first Democrat since 1958. How do you think you achieved that?
By listening. I'm going to say it again, by listening. What even politicians, I think, fail to recognize sometimes, Deborah, is the relationship between a voter and a politician is not dissimilar from any partnership, whether it be a marriage or a friendship, some type of a union. You have to listen to your partner, to your customer, and validate their feelings, whether or not you agree. And I realized that in my district, if I was going to succeed, I couldn't succeed by just pandering to base Democrats. I couldn't succeed by just telling everybody what we had to do. That I could succeed by listening to people, their fears, their joys, their dreams, their concerns. So I bought a 1960 International Harvester Metro van, designed, by the way, to remind people the last time a Democrat had served in the office, which was 1960. And I literally, Deborah, I put coffee and lemonade in that thing. I drove it all around my district, probably thousands of miles in 2017, 2018. I'd put out a couple lawn chairs, and I would just ask people, invite them to come up and talk. And I listened, and I'll tell you, every one of those people that came and took the time to visit with me probably told 100 people that they had a neat conversation with the guy running for Congress. And my identity, Democrat, mattered less than the fact that I was willing to actually show up, take the heat sometimes, listen to people, validate their concerns. And unless somebody was a repugnant, sexist or racist or anti-Semite, I was thoughtful and kind and accommodating. And that's what I've tried to be since. That's how we won. And we built a beautiful community of Democrats, Republicans, independents, Women activated in extraordinary ways. We call them the Dean team. There's still an extraordinary group of women that have really bonded, probably about 100, that really I give full credit to flipping the district in 2018 because nobody can do it alone. And it was a beautiful experience. You know, it was fun, it was joyful, it was inspiring. It reminded me, as my presidential run reminded me, Deborah, that our country is so much less divided than the entertainment industry would have us believe.
Right.
You just got to listen to people. You just got to let them know that they matter, that their perspectives count, and they're not deplorable or despicable or stupid, that they're humans. And depending on our life circumstances and life story, that's what changes the lens on things. But if we can't be empathetic, you know, then we can't be human. And that's what I learned.
Well, it sounds to me like your daughter's a good listener, and she actually was listening to what Trump was saying, which I think a lot of people weren't really listening, because what he said he was going to do, he pretty much did. And that's a fearful time for anybody in the category of other. And your daughter at that point, she's 16. Had she come out?
No, hadn't come out. I had no idea. You know, she had just overcome, like I said, Hodgkin's lymphoma. You know, if you remember in 2018, actually healthcare was one of the driving policy issues in that election. Trump wanted to do away with the ACA. And my daughter Pia, after that horrible health scare and experience, she also recognized her privilege, her good fortune of having a wonderful children's hospital, a family that could afford not just her care and the insurance, but a family that could actually go to the hospital and be with her. And she, during her experience at Children's Hospital in Minneapolis, saw that so many of the kids in her hallway didn't have anybody there from morning to evening because their parents or guardian had to work. And my daughter Pia was surrounded with us all the time. And because of that experience, she and a friend started a little organization called Pabs Packs, where they stuffed these beautiful little backpacks with cozy toys and games and items to keep young kids occupied who had long-term stays at hospitals. They distributed them to hospitals around the country because she was affected by that experience. So I think between her sexuality, I think between learning about the healthcare system and privilege and those who have and those who have not, she was really moved by that and Trump's specific intention to literally take healthcare away from people. And she knew that her life was saved because it was available. I think that was one of the motivating factors for her and so many, you know, millions of others. And here he comes, right back.
Right back. And we're going to get to that too. But it sounds like she had that charitable spirit, which was galvanized by your family and your background, because what I read about you, you've always been in service to your community, whatever that community was. And so much gratitude for that. So many more people need to really put some sweat equity into things. You know, I always say it's easier for those of us who have a little bit of money to write a check, but it's a lot harder to get creative and put some sweat equity in there, which your daughter clearly did. So she sounds like an amazing person. And is she now on pins and needles again with this upcoming election?
Yeah, she's motivated. She works for Deloitte, lives in Austin, Texas. My daughter Daniela works and lives in Manhattan, both independent, successful young women, both of whom are deeply concerned about women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, climate, gun violence, all the problems that most of which are solvable with people of character and principle leading us. And yes, they and their entire generation, as you well know, are not just gravely concerned, but are taking it to the streets and college campuses. And it has a semblance of 1968 again. It's not Vietnam, but it's a massive disenfranchisement and anger and fear, I think, that is starting to really, hopefully, motivate young people, because if that generation chooses to stay home on election day, we're going to be in big trouble. And I just hope they convert that. My dad used to say, you got to convert chicken shit into chicken salad. And I think this is the great challenge right now for Democrats and those who object to Trump. We have got to convert this to chicken salad. And that means unifying and organizing and mobilizing and energizing and getting people out to vote, including my daughters, who will surely, but their generations got to join them.
And I have to ask you for advice on this one. So we vote, but we cannot change the Supreme Court situation.
Yep.
So
Right.
how can we, as women, and just anybody out there that, even I know a lot of men who call themselves feminists, how can we change this Roe v. Wade that's been overturned? What can we do? We're helpless, are we not?
No, I'd argue, well, I know it feels like we're helpless, but, at the end of the day, Deborah, elections have consequences. Not voting has consequences. Voting for the wrong person has consequences. Those who would turn the blind eye to women's reproductive freedom in favor of economic success or in favor of other policy single issue voters to ignore what was so clearly a risk is a shame. And by the way, Democrats, as Hillary Clinton just referenced a few weeks ago, Democrats have failed for 50 years. When we had opportunities to codify women's reproductive rights, we didn't, because it wasn't politically expedient at the time. As a result, the Supreme Court, basically, when they made their recent decision, they said to the Congress, look, in the absence of the United States Congress passing a law one way or the other, there's nothing in the Constitution that speaks to this, so we will leave it up to the states. That's what they did. They didn't say, yes, abortion should be legal, it shouldn't be legal. What they said is, in the absence of Congress acting, states shall have the right to do so. So I would say two things. Do everything you can in your state to keep those rights safe and secure. Minnesota now has constitutionalized it. We are an island in a sea of the withdrawal of rights. I'm proud of that. So activate in your states. And then elections. Every presidential election is massively consequential. I'm saddened that we have lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court. I think each president should be able to either appoint one justice or we should have 18-year term limits so that there's always a cycling on and off. But at the end of the day, we're a democracy. And we can complain and we have the right to, but at the end of the day, if we can't offer candidates who can win, we're going to be hemorrhaging support. We're going to be hemorrhaging the opportunity to make a difference, and we are going to be hemorrhaging decency and progressive perspectives on the Supreme Court, and that's where we're headed right now. So at the end of the day, we got to mobilize is what we got to do.
Well, the fact is, though, we have these Supreme Court justices, predominantly Republican. I always thought they were supposed to be nonpartisan, but clearly that's not the case. How do we make things change? Do we sign petitions all over the place and try to get a bill put into place? How do we set limits on Supreme Court justices? Is that ever a thing? How do you change constitutional amendments? How do you do that?
So, letters, petitions, I mean, they feel good. It feels like you're making a difference. But let me tell you, Deborah, members of Congress are human beings. And if we're in Washington, D.C., and if we see hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, unified about an issue, let me assure you, nothing moves the needle faster in a democracy than the physical manifestation of people's perspective. But the sad truth is we live in an era where people think as long as they do a tweet or they do something on their phone or they send a message or sign a document that, the rest will take care of itself. We need people, if you really, really care, people have to mobilize. And the best way to demonstrate to those who are in positions to change the law is to do so in the faces of those of us who make the laws. And I'm saying to be respectful, but showing up in mass, that's the only thing that changes things in democracies, because you have to demonstrate. That's why they're called demonstrations. You are demonstrating the importance of an issue. And I think that we as a country have lost a little bit of that sensibility of what it takes when something egregious has occurred. And frankly, not since the late 1960s and the anti-war movement have we seen that mass mobilization, consistent mobilization of protesters that ultimately did move the needle. I think we need the same thing here. And my Republican colleagues know that they're on the wrong side of history. Many of them have to swallow the pill and kind of walk the company line, but they know it's not politically advantageous. It is, even in red states, I think majorities of voters still believe that a woman should make that choice. Where we can unify, by the way, is trying to reduce the incidence of unwanted pregnancies. But in the meantime, this is the time to mobilize. And I think that means physically to show up and let people know how you feel, because signing a petition doesn't mean a thing.
It feels like there's this effort to force women into having more children.
I'm one who believes that those who feel so strongly about reducing freedom of choice for women, they're pro-birth. They're not pro-life, because I've challenged them before. If you're pro-life, why have you done nothing to stop school shootings? If you're pro-life, why are we so opposed to spending more on nutrition and counseling and safety and security and education for our young people and kids? If you're pro-life, why do you not care about the environment and reducing the incidence of greenhouse gases? If you're pro-life, why are we so focused on war and not investing in peace? How can you call yourself that? I would respect you more if you said you were pro-life and you fell on the side of pro-life policy. So but I also don't want to demean people, because if we're not going to be respectful of those who see it differently, we cannot at least join hands to reduce the incidence. And I think that is the middle ground. I don't think it's about debating how many weeks is reasonable. I think the middle ground is, let's unify to educate, provide birth control, and to identify policies that would reduce the incidence of putting women in a position where they have to or wish to forego their pregnancies. If we did that, everybody wins.
Well, I want to know if you would consider this Trump Republican Party tyrannical.
I do not consider the Republican Party writ large tyrannical. I consider Donald Trump to be dangerous and not necessarily greatly competent, and his retribution perspective very concerning. But I do not yet see evidence of tyranny, and I'm hoping that remains the case. And that's why, again, at least Democrats flipping the House of Representatives is imperative to have some resistance to what could be a tyrannical government if he has the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Yes, then we might be in trouble, because the leverage he'll have, the power he has, and the sycophants that are elected and pray to him, that becomes real dangerous. And that's why voting in this election is so important.
Yeah, do you think he'd ever leave?
I was concerned that he may not, but I do have faith in the system and in most Republicans, certainly all Democrats, that that would never occur. And I don't think Republicans want it. And by the way, that talk about him not leaving, he thrives on that. He thrives on Democrats saying if he's elected, he's never going to leave office. He's going to do some really stupid things, I think, but I don't think that'll be one of them.
Wow. Well, that is a concern with a dictator, and he seems to want to be a dictator. He aligns himself with the dictators of the world more so than he does the democratic leaders of the world, which is quite scary.
I'm concerned. I'm concerned about two things. I don't think he will attract people of character and competency into his next administration should he win. Believe it or not, he had some good people in his last one. I worked with him. I can tell you that I got a lot of work done with his White House because he had a pretty good team in place. And I was pleased by what I saw. I think that's going to be harder. I think there'll be an exodus of talented, decent, hardworking federal employees. I think his cabinet will be further to the right and probably comprised of people who we will be shocked by. And I do think he's going to pursue retribution. I think he's going to withdraw us from a lot of our alliances, or at least try to. I think he's going to be more of an isolationist president. I think he will continue to enrich the wealthiest Americans. And I think he will do some draconian things at our border that will negatively impact immigration in the United States and mistreat people. And I don't think he will take action on anything relative to the environment. If anything, we'll go in the opposite direction. I don't think we'll see anything changed on gun violence. And surely, if anything, we're going to see more restrictions placed on women's reproductive rights. I think that's what will happen. And I think beginning, if he doesn't win, I think we're going to be in for another really dangerous number of weeks or months when he continues to probably argue, no matter what, that the election somehow was stolen. Those are the two scenarios I see playing out. The only good news is if he wins, it's only 4 years, and we steel ourselves and reorganize and re-energize and get ready for 2028, because we cannot allow his successors to continue this nonsense.
But so much damage can be done in those 4 years, like pulling
Yep.
away from NATO. This
Yeah.
takes me back to, like, historically, Charles Lindbergh during the Second World War wanting to keep this country closed off and isolationistic.
Yeah.
And how would that have fared for us?
In this day and age, we do that. You've got China just waiting to fill that void, and they're doing it left and right. And I'm gravely concerned. If we withdraw from world leadership, we will pay a real price and of great consequence. And that's just the truth. And I can only pray and hope that should he win, that there will be people at that cabinet table in that White House that will be keeping an eye on things, because we're going to need them. And that could be the difference between great tragedy and maybe even moderate success.
I just have to ask, where were they in the last 4 years?
They were there. I mean, and frankly, a lot of people who, many of us wondered, a lot of us who threw shade on people for just being part of that administration are actually people who had good principles, had good character, and they felt that it was better to take the heat from being in that administration, but at least being in that arena. And there are a number of them. I don't want to really out them, but I know them. And I think some of those people should be actually celebrated rather than demeaned, because if we condemn the people who are willing to work in his administration, we're going to actually be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. I hope there are some good people and talent and character that work there, because if we don't, then we really are in trouble. And thank God we have a military that is separate from the executive branch, because that would be extraordinarily consequential, as you surely know. And that's why keeping, maintaining either the Senate, which is going to be complicated, or winning back the House is so terribly important, to have at least one check and balance on some of the most important issues. If he doesn't win the House but wins the presidency, at least it gives us a pushback for policies that we will find to be obnoxious. And by the way, look, maybe there will be some results from a Trump administration that will be positive for the country. I'm an optimist, but based on experience and based on what he is arguing needs to be done, I'm gravely concerned.
Well, people out there, vote down ballot at least.
I'm glad you say that, by the way. People should know that. No president can run this government. It's well beyond human capacity to be a leader of a country our size in this time. It does matter who you surround yourself with.
Right. What makes you hopeful about the future of our country?
A lot. I'm glad you're ending with this, because when I ran for president, I really rediscovered how extraordinary most Americans are, of all colors and races and religions and politics and communities and urban and rural. And it really restored and energized me to recognize, as I think I said in the very beginning of this podcast, that the angertainment industry, even in cable, is making billions of dollars off of portraying this country as being so divided that it's intractable, that we can't do anything about it. They use fear, by the way, both sides use fear to motivate people, and it's really effective. But the truth is, most people in this country are decent, and nobody wants to see a civil war, and nobody wants to see tyranny and a withdrawal of freedoms and wars and famines and school shootings. And we're actually unified in those ways. We simply we have different life experiences and different lenses through which we view it, and therefore we think the solutions may be different. So that experience really restored my faith in our country and in people. And my hope is that people recognize that what is portrayed on TV through what happens in Congress or on cable news is actually not a great portrayal of, I think, the reality of most Americans. And I think that's probably what gives me a lot of hope. When I was just in Normandy, spent time with 100, 103, 106-year-old veterans of D-Day, to know what they endured, what so many gave their lives for. That makes me hopeful. To see Democrats and Republicans in our delegation hugging each other and crying together because of how moved we were by these extraordinary stories of bravery and heroism, that makes me optimistic. My friendships with Republicans in Congress makes me optimistic. My belief in our country having overcome far worse circumstances makes me optimistic. And somehow, some way, we figure it out. And I think we will. I think we've got to brace ourselves and steel ourselves perhaps for some tough more years ahead. But I am hopeful and optimistic that things are going to get better. And we're still the luckiest people in the world living in this country this time, in this kind of government. And we got a lot of work to do. And I think my closing message would be to inspire people to participate, organize, mobilize, get out the vote, come to Washington and make your perspectives clear, encourage people to run for city council and school boards and mayors and state representatives and Congress. We got to be participants in democracy. And when I see young people come to Washington that I give tours of the Capitol to and asking great questions and excited to be public servants, I get excited and inspired and optimistic. So keep the faith. We will be okay if you participate in some way, shape, or form. We all have something to share, and that's my request and my invitation.
Good. Democracy is hanging by a thread. So do the right thing when you get out there. Be informed, well informed, with factual news, not alternative facts. When you go out there to vote at the voting polls in November. Thank you so much, Dean Phillips, for joining us today. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you here sharing your story and your perspective.
Thank you. Well, peace and keep the faith.
This episode of Deborahcratic was hosted by me, Deborah Drucker. It was produced by Lee Rocker with editing and recording by Adam Burt. Our amazing music was performed by Amy Nelson and Kathy Guthrie of Folk Uke. Be sure to rate and review this episode wherever you listen to podcasts. For more Deborahcratic, check out Deborahcratic.com and our Instagram at Deborahcratic. That's DEBORAH Cratic, like democratic. Until next time.
Political